On the night of October 15, 1946, the world stood still. Inside the cold stone walls of a Nuremberg cell, Hermann Göring brought his own story to a violent end. Just hours before the executioner's rope was to claim him, a hidden cyanide capsule provided a final, defiant exit. His death closed his chapter in history, a chapter written in fire and steel. But as the man vanished, a new, darker story began for those he left behind. What happened to the family that once stood at the pinnacle of power? What became of the women who bore the Göring name? Their journey began in the unimaginable luxury of Carinhall, a forest palace built on the spoils of an empire. But that world was crumbling. From the height of Reich social life to the uncertainty of post-war Germany, the Göring name fell faster than the bombs over Berlin. Emmy and Etta Göring watched the world they knew disappear. The transition from royalty to refugees happened in a heartbeat. In late April 1945, the end was no longer a threat, it was a reality. Soviet forces were advancing through the heart of Germany. Hermann Göring gave the final order. His beloved Carinhall was to be destroyed. If he could not have it, no one would. The grand estate was reduced to rubble and ash. By the time the last structure fell, his family was already fleeing south. They were moved deeper into Bavaria, toward Berchtesgaden, the last stronghold of a collapsing Reich leadership. In scattered alpine retreats, they waited in the mist. The Reich was falling, and the mountains offered no more protection. On May 6, 1945, the road finally ended. Near Radstadt, Austria, U.S. troops intercepted the fleeing marshal. The surrender was quiet. Within hours, the man who once commanded the skies was a prisoner of the Allied forces. Shortly afterward, Allied authorities located Emmy and Etta. They were no longer the first family. They were dependents of a war criminal. They were escorted to temporary holding sites. The transition was sharp and cold. They were now subjects of a new authority. These sites were created to prevent escape and secure potential witnesses. The cage was closing in on them. From requisitioned hotels to guarded houses, the message was the same. Their freedom was a thing of the past. Living conditions varied, but the reality was fixed. They were waiting for a world that would never return. Allied interrogators soon arrived. Emmy, once the social first lady of the Reich, was now a person of interest. They sought to peel back the layers of a regime she had personified. They questioned her about influence and privileges. She had been the most visible woman of the era, her image inseparable from the inner circle. Now, the cameras were gone. She was pressed on her proximity to decision-makers. For the first time, she had no status, no wealth, and no protection. For Etta, the transition was a silent earthquake. At only 7 years old, her life of ceremony had vanished. Suddenly, there were only unfamiliar rooms and the heavy boots of military guards. She held tightly to her small suitcase. Every day, she asked the same question. When will I see my father? The true ordeal was only beginning. November 1945. The eyes of the world turned to Nuremberg. The ruins of the Reich were still smoldering as the International Military Tribunal opened. Hermann Göring was no longer the flamboyant Reichsmarshal. He was now the most prominent defendant, stripped of his medals but not his defiance. Through the winter and spring of 1946, his testimony dominated the headlines. He spoke not as a criminal, but as a statesman defending a fallen regime. He denied criminal responsibility. He defended the regime's decisions with a sharp, calculated intellect, seeking to preserve his place in history. For Emmy and Etta, still under Allied supervision, the trial was a ghost that haunted their every hour. They listened from a distance. Months of uncertainty followed. Emmy was not permitted to communicate directly with her husband. The silence was absolute. Then came October 1946, the day of the verdict. The tribunal reached its conclusion after nearly a year of testimony. Göring was found guilty on major counts. The sentence was handed down, death by hanging. The end was now certain. When the news reached Emmy and Etta, observers noted a quiet, paralyzing shock. The man they loved was to be executed. But on the night of October 15th, Göring took his final act into his own hands, a hidden cyanide capsule, a final escape. Emmy reportedly struggled to accept the reality of his suicide. The finality was a weight she could not lift. Etta, only 8 years old, asked the question that broke the silence. Where has my father gone? The death of the man triggered the total dismantling of the Göring estate. Authorities seized everything that remained. Properties, bank accounts, and valuables were confiscated. The symbols of a decade of plunder were stripped away. Restitution efforts began for the thousands of items Göring had collected. The hunt for stolen art was now a priority. Investigators tracked hundreds of items from his collection to repositories in Bavaria and Austria, pieces of a stolen history. Artwork that once adorned the walls of Karen Hall was now held as evidence, a legacy of theft laid bare. Emmy's own role came under intense scrutiny. As Göring's wife, she had been highly visible, attending every state ceremony. Investigators described her as the social first lady of the Reich. Her face was inseparable from the regime's public image. The financial loss was total. Without an estate or privilege, Emmy faced a future without support. Pension rights were denied. Edda was young, but the Göring name was a mark she would carry forever, a name that carried a heavy historical stigma. In 1947, Emmy appeared before a Munich tribunal. The transition from privilege to judgment was complete. The world was watching again. Not a statesman, but the survivors of a nightmare facing the reckoning of history. 1947. The dust of Nuremberg had settled, but for Emmy Göring, a new judgment awaited. She appeared before a Munich tribunal, the widow of a ghost. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence, photographs and records showing her at the very center of state-sponsored cultural organizations. Her defense was consistent. She claimed she was merely a private person placed in a public role, a wife, not a participant in the machinery of state. In March 1948, the verdict came. Emmy was classified as a major offender, Belastet, one of the most serious categories under denazification. The consequences were immediate and total. She lost all remaining property claims. Employment and travel were strictly restricted. Her pension rights were denied. The wealth of Karen Hall was now a memory, replaced by a cold financial vacuum. Appeals would eventually ease some of the limits over the years, but the central penalties remained a permanent shadow over her life. She eventually resettled in Munich. The transition from a forest palace to a modest apartment was a physical manifestation of her fall. Support came from unexpected places, acquaintances from her old theater circles. In the wings of her former life, she found a strange stability. Accounts of her life thereafter differ. Some spoke of hardship, others of a quiet, dignified stability amidst the wreckage of her name. For Edda, the birth celebrated by the regime was now a liability. Her childhood had ended in internment, and her future was tied to her father's sins. Edda was not subject to denazification herself, but she was never free from it. The Göring name was a heavy, invisible yoke. The name carried a stigma that reached into every corner of her life. In the classrooms and streets of Munich, she was always the daughter. Authorities briefly considered outside guardianship for the girl, a debate over whether the daughter of the Reich could be raised by its survivors. Ultimately, she was allowed to remain with Emmy under strict supervision, a family of two, bound by a shared, traumatic history. Edda later attended school in Munich, a quiet student, moving through a world that whispered behind her back. She studied law, perhaps an attempt to understand the systems that had judged her father and now defined her own existence. She worked briefly as a clerk before finding a different path, a life of quiet routine, far from the cinemas and gyms of Karen Hall. She spent decades as a medical laboratory technician, a life of science and precision, perhaps a refuge from the chaos of her legacy. She never married, she never had children. The bloodline and the shadow would stop with her. An era was slowly fading into silence. 1967. Emmy Göring broke her long silence. She published her autobiography, On der Seite meines Mannes, At the Side of My Husband. In its pages, she portrayed the man the world knew as a war criminal as a sympathetic, misunderstood figure. She defended his character until the very end. She never changed her stance. To Emmy, he was not the architect of air power or the plunderer of Europe. He was the husband she chose. On June 8, 1973, the First Lady of the Reich passed away in Munich at the age of 80. A ghost of a fallen empire finally found rest. Edda Göring had been born into a world of celebration. In 1938, Hitler himself had served as her godfather at her baptism at Karen Hall. Her childhood home was a kingdom of pool, cinema, and even a private zoo, a landscape of absolute privilege built on the brink of an abyss. In the 1970s, Edda briefly returned to the public eye, not as a leader, but as a living link to a past that Germany was trying to forget. She was linked to the yacht, Karen II, once owned by her father, a vessel of luxury that now carried the weight of history and scandal. Through her association with journalist Gerd Heidemann, the Göring name surfaced again in headlines, a reminder of the plunder that remained. In later interviews, Edda's memories were shielded by love. She recalled her father as a loving parent, despite the undeniable historical record. The conflict between private memory and public history defined her. She chose the father over the marshal, the man over the monster. She lived a quiet life, moving between Austria and Munich, a medical technician who walked the streets as a shadow of a former world. On December 21, 2018, Etta Goering died. With her, one of the last direct connections to the inner circle of the Third Reich was severed. But while Etta chose loyalty, another relative took a very different path, a choice that would break the bloodline forever. Bettina Goering, a grandniece raised far from the luxury of Carenhall, spoke openly about the crushing weight of the family legacy. Living in the United States, she faced the history her family had written. The name was not a badge of honor, but a burden to be discarded. She revealed a staggering decision. She and her brother had voluntarily undergone sterilization, a radical act to end the Goering bloodline. It was a way to break from inherited history to ensure that the shadow of their ancestor would not haunt another generation. Her stance contrasted sharply with Etta's loyalty. Two descendants, two vastly different responses to the same dark shadow. One chose memory, the other chose closure. But the shadow of the past remains, a reminder of the price of power and the weight of a name. The forest has reclaimed much of what was once the empire of Hermann Goering. The stones of Carenhall, once symbols of absolute power, are now just ruins in the shadows. Nature does not remember the titles, the medals, or the plunder. It only knows the silence that follows the fall. The physical world they built is gone. But the historical debate remains. Emmy's loyalty was viewed by some as a wife's devotion, and by others as a calculated denial of the truth. Her autobiography was her final testimony, a narrative that sought to humanize a monster and preserve a version of the past that history could not accept. Etta Goering chose a different kind of silence. She lived in the world but was not of it, a living artifact of a regime that had celebrated her birth and then vanished. Her decades in the laboratory were a refuge of precision, a life measured in milligrams and slides, far from the grand theater of her childhood. To Etta, the historical record was one thing. Her father's love was another. She carried that private memory to her grave, unyielding and isolated. With her death in 2018, a direct line was severed, but the shadow of the past did not disappear. It only changed form. Bettina Goering's choice was the most radical of all, a voluntary end to the bloodline, a decision to stop the cycle of inherited history. It was a rejection of the name and the legacy, a declaration that the sins of the forefather would not be carried by those who came after. How do we live with the history we inherit? The Goering family provided two vastly different answers, one of loyalty and one of closure. The fall from luxury to obscurity was not just a financial loss, it was a moral reckoning. The price of proximity to power is paid for generations. Today, the name Goering is a ghost that haunts the archives and the memories of a nation. Munich has rebuilt, but the scars remain hidden in the architecture. Some chose to speak, others to remain silent. But history has a way of finding its voice, even when the rooms are empty. The world of Emmy and Etta ended in 1945. What followed was a long, slow fading, a family drama played out on the stage of a world catastrophe. The mountains still stand, indifferent to the rise and fall of men. The shadow of Hermann Goering has finally lengthened into the twilight of history. The story of the Goerings is a reminder that no empire is eternal and no name is immune to the judgment of time. The chapter is closed. The shadow remains. 15 minutes of history and a lifetime of consequences.